Hi, everyone. I wanted to start out by thinking about the idea of typography. Because that is what this course is about. We're going to be thinking really deeply about type. There are several definitions for typography. The composition of printed material from movable type is one, and the art and technique of this, or the arrangement and appearance of printed matter. So, those are the definitions if you look in a dictionary. And typography is more than that, though. Words really originated as gestures of the body, and the first typeface was modeled on the forms of calligraphy. And typeface design is really a blend of the organic gesture of the hand and the geometric nature of the machine. And so these tensions really inform and invigorate type design. A really critical invention that occurred was the invention of the letterpress. The letterpress is a printing technique of relief printing, and it's a process by which many copies are produced by repeated direct impression of an inked raised surface against sheets or a continuous roll of paper. And typefaces are manufactured for infinite repetition. And so you arrange the type on the letterpress. So it is that process as opposed to arranging on the computer using a software. Prior to the letterpress, early books were handwritten by scribes in monasteries. And these scribes were production letterers, and the head scribe was usually the art director, production manager, and they would collaborate with illustrators when graphics were needed. And a 200-page manuscript would present 4 or 5 months of labor for a scribe and 25 sheepskins of parchment. The Gutenberg Bible took about 3 years of constant printing to complete the famous Bible, which had 1,284 pages, and Gutenberg printed a total of 200 Bibles. 47 still exist. And so this was a huge invention. And it really changed the Western world in many ways. Gutenberg invented his Bible in Germany in the 15th century. He was a metal worker and cast movable type for the printing press around 1450. And the other thing that made this possible was the invention of paper and wooden blocks of type stamps. The growth of universities was really making books more in demand, and the revolution of writing in the West made it possible to mass produce books. And so all these factors kind of came into play. More universities, a huge demand for books, revolutionary new inventions in the West, including wooden blocks and paper. And this all was the perfect storm for the invention of the printing press. It had been invented earlier in China, but had been proven less useful there. The Chinese writing system contained tens of thousands of distinct characters, whereas the Latin alphabet is more a translation of sounds. And there's only a small amount of characters in the Latin alphabet as opposed to the Chinese writing system. So you can kind of see the font used in Gutenberg's Bible. And early font was the early fonts used by the scribe, or the writing system or characters created by the scribes, was called blackletter. And so Gutenberg's famous Bible was printed in blackletter. There's other names for it. You can call it Gothic or Fractal or Old English. But it's basically early manuscript lettering, and it's not very legible in a printed book, but it's really beautiful when it's hand-drawn. And here's a couple of pages of the Gutenberg Bible, and you can see that there's multiple colors. And for each color, if you use a printing press, each color has to be run through the press separately. And here we have 3 colors, so that would mean 3 different complete printings through the press. The printing press also really changed things like music, because for the first time you could create printed music, and this really expanded how many people had access. And this is a sample of the first musical book to be printed, and you can see the shape of the type and the imperfections of the final product. And before the printing press, you can kind of see over here, in the 15th century, Western music was written by hand and preserved in these really beautiful manuscripts. So the origins of the alphabet is interesting. The first kind of, they're not really letters, but they're symbols that we know of, are called pictograms. And we've found pictograms in various parts of the world. For example, in caves in France, we found these specific pictograms that we think were created between 10,000 and 8,000 BC. And we're not sure why they were created. They show these little images, sometimes referring to hunting. So hunting instructions is one theory. But they're often used in grids as well, and maybe it was a system of organization. You also had ideograms, which sort of evolved over time. And these were symbols that were developed to create more complex objects and concepts. So you can kind of see here, the hunter leaves home, sleeps one night on an island, goes to another island and sleeps 2 nights, hunts and kills a sea lion and returns home. So this might be an example of a story created with pictograms. With ideographs, they're a little bit more complicated. For example, communicating concepts such as horizon or 1 month. And then you have the alphabet, which was created, and the alphabet was created, the first known alphabet, the Phoenician alphabet, was created 1500 to 1000 BC, and it's a consolidation of letter forms. There were 22 symbols to communicate ideas. The Greek alphabet over here is kind of an offshoot. It was created based on the Phoenician alphabet, and the Greeks basically changed 5 consonants and vowels, and what we know as S-E-I-O-U. They also kind of invented the left to right or right to left style of reading. And you can kind of see how they gradually adopted the Phoenician alphabet for use around 800 BCE. And they substituted simpler sounds to represent the letters, such as our ABCs today. And it's 24 letters that have been used to write the Greek language since the late 9th or early 8th century BCE. Eventually, the Romans adopted and modified the Greek alphabet. 13 letters were left unchanged: A, B, E, H, I, K, M, N, O, T, X, Y, and Z. 8 letters were revised, and 2 letters were added. More modifications brought this to the 26-letter alphabet. And the Romans also invented capital letters. So handwriting was an art prior to the invention of the printing press, and a lot of time was spent perfecting it. And so Roman inscription letters were made with square edge reed writing tools or marking devices. They kind of are like 2 pencils tied together and held at an angle, and this would produce a variety of thick and thin strokes, as well as serifs of the Roman alphabet. And prior to movable type, there were 2 popular schools of writing. One was called blackletter, which we've talked about, and you can kind of see it here. The other was called humanistic. Blackletter forms were hard to read when you printed them on the printing press. They're much more intuitive for hand-drawn books. But humanist type is basically a much better version, and so that was what was eventually adopted for our printing presses. The Polyglot Bible, with the rise of the printing press in the 1450s, the Bible could be propagated much more efficiently, and this is the first printed polyglot of the entire Bible. And the work started in 1502 and took 15 years to be completed. And it really was expensive. And there was a famous cardinal, Cardinal Cisneros, and he acquired many manuscripts and invited the top religious scholars of the day to work on the ambitious task of compiling a massive and complete polyglot to revive basically the languishing study of the scriptures. Eusebius was the first Roman type to be consciously designed, and it was designed by typographer Nicholas Jenson, and he was from Venice. And Jenson really sought to create individual letters, and it's really kind of our first typeface that was created for the printing press, or specifically for the printing press. And basically, the letters were really designed to combine harmoniously on the page. So as we look at different things that have been printed in America, one thing we can look at is the phone book redesign. So Bell Gothic is designed for maximum legibility in the adverse conditions of small print on a poor quality newsprint paper. So when you print a phone book, for example, the ink tends to absorb and spread out. It is therefore really hard to print something on this really thin paper. I don't know if you guys even use phone books anymore, but if you've ever seen a phone book, it's on this really thin, sort of delicate paper. And so they knew that they needed to solve this problem. So they invented a font called Bell Gothic to really maximize legibility in these conditions. And it's a realist sans serif font. It was designed by Chauncey Griffith, and it was eventually replaced by Matthew Cotter's typeface Bell Centennial in 1978. But what I'm kind of getting at here is typeface design started to emerge really rapidly in the late 18th century and early 19th century as advertising and the economies of Europe and the Americas grew. And this is kind of a sample of the Bell Centennial, a little larger, so you can kind of see it. You can see that there's imperfections, and it's really, made so that it can spread out a little bit, and it can kind of absorb as it spreads out. This is the New York Times logo nameplate, and the letter forms on which the nameplate is based are known as blackletter or Gothic, and that's what we've been thinking about as the first kind of hand-drawn type used by the scribes. And so when you look at this New York Times nameplate, you'll see that it is that old style of blackletter. And in 1851, when Henry Jarvis Raymond had to choose a nameplate for his newspaper, the New York Daily Times, as it was called at that time, he wanted to model the Times as closely as possible on the London Times, which used Gothic type. Gothic type and blackletter are kind of synonymous. And so a few changes were made. Terminals were trimmed and edges were smooth, but you get this nameplate. And you can kind of see the New Yorker here is set on a tight 3-column grid, and it's established by its first art editor 82 years ago. So we're also going to think in this class a lot about grid-based design and thinking about typeface for grid-based design. You can kind of see the New Yorker up here too, like how the columns are designed. Here's an example of type in the book Animal Farm by George Orwell. And you can kind of see some visual hierarchy going on. So you see the letters here are much smaller, and then you have some emphasis in the middle of the page, which is kind of beautiful and striking. As you sort of read the book, you sort of pause here and really look at that enlarged font and ponder it. The New York subway uses Helvetica. And one of the challenges when the subway was in its early years was that it was very chaotic. The first signs in the New York subway were created by Hines and Lafarge architects, And they established this sort of mosaic station, so you can kind of see these names on platform walls. There were also large illuminated porcelain enamel signs hung over the express platforms using hand lettering on white background. And there were painted station names on the round cast iron columns. There were also a variety of other porcelain enamel and hand painted signs made by other companies. But the problem was they were chaotic. There were so many different styles and variety that it was really hard to sort of navigate the subway. And, even though these signs are really beautiful and interesting and kind of bring us back to our history, there was this real need to redesign and make the subway a lot more consistent. And so there was a conscious effort to redesign all of the letter forms, and Matthew Carter was commissioned to design a typeface for this, and he eventually named his typeface Airport, which was based on what we commonly know as Helvetica today, which we're going to learn a lot more about. And it made the subway experience much more clean and simple. People could understand where they were and where they were going. And that is one thing that we'll talk about with typography, because it's really important in information design to create type that communicates really effectively. And so we're just going to kind of look at a few signs here. So type is everywhere, and there's all different types of letter forms and types of design. And some of it really beautiful. Some of it helps us create clarity in our lives. Sometimes it creates discord or even chaos. And what I challenge you to do is to really start to look at fonts and think about them. Do they work? What are they saying? How do they inform the design? How is the font chosen helping the design or perhaps hurting the design? There are specific fonts that were designed once we moved to phones and computers that made fonts much more legible on a screen. Vinyl type, for example, was designed by Lust to put on the Hog in 2001, and it's really designed to facilitate nighttime advertising. So when you design a typeface, you think strategically about what that typeface will be used for, and that is what motivates the design. Stamps, if you ever get a chance, look at stamps, because they're really small, they're usually really ornate, they can be very beautiful, and the type has to be legible and visible. So it can be a challenging project. And so there's a lot of really beautiful, amazing design that goes into these stamp designs. And so here's some examples of that. Here's a United Nations population poster, and you can see that it's a very chaotic, but there's lots of different scales of text in here, where there's some that's really large, some that's really small, some that's hand-drawn. The shapes of the text on top, the black letters, are very, crisp and clean and straight, whereas the other letters are much more sort of gestural, hand-drawn. So going back to what we kind of originally started with, what is typography? It's a lot of things, but we can think of it for the purposes of this class as the art and technique of printing with movable type, which is important, the composition of printed material for movable type, and the arrangement and appearance of printed matter. So that can be our kind of formal definition for the class. There's a great wood type and printing museum called the Hamilton Wood Type and Printing Museum. So if you ever are in Wisconsin and you have time, go see it. There's some really beautiful examples of typographic design in there, and also of these amazing prints done on a letterpress. So type is a primary means to solve design problems in graphic design. to be a graphic designer, you also have to really understand how to utilize and design with type. You don't necessarily have to be a typographer. Typographers are sort of their own subgroup in graphic design, but you have to understand it deeply, think about it, and utilize type to help solve your design problem. We're going to be looking at this a lot more next week, but there's 5 classic typefaces that we're going to think about. There's old style, there's transitional, there's modern, there's century, and there's sans serif. And so we're just going to think about that. I'm just going to show you these terms, and I'll explain them a lot more as we kind of go through the course next week. So that's my intro to this course, and we're going to be having a lecture pretty much every week for at least the first 3 or 4 weeks. And just let me know if you have any questions.